Okay, I'm just gonna assume since this is working and it's only been 5 seconds. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, all 5 of you. So exciting to see you. I wanted to talk today about a very peculiar grammatical feature of Wordsworth's poetry, which is that he likes things to be lonely together. He likes there to be lonely valleys. He likes to be lonely companions. He likes to be alongside lonely cliffs and lonely mountains, but also with lonely thoughts and lonely shades of mind and consciousness. So a lot of plural lonelinesses. And when you think about it, we just generally don't envision solitary and lonely objects as a plural, because solitary by definition means on your own, by yourself. So, I've collected you a bunch of quotes here, and we can think through them together, but I want to give you my 4 theories as to why this is happening. And this I've been struggling with. I have 4 theories because I'm not very pleased with any of them, but I'm pleased with the overall picture that the 4 of them combined create. And just to give you a sense of numbers, if you look at the Prelude, which is the longest poem that Wordsworth's written, you have 9 instances of the word solitary. 4 of them are with plurals, and of the 5 that are one solitary person, many are then with the woods. Many have a relationship to others immediately attached, even when you are solitary. So none of them is all that comfortable, and from the lonesome variety or lonely, again, maybe not such impressive numbers, but I would say a full 1 in 3 ends up being pluralized, which again is extraordinary. I invite you to think about the last time you've written about things, lonely plurals, being lonely together, lonely humans. It's definitely, or if you've thought about instances, Wordsworth in the Prelude has, I believe, six instances of solitudes. So the loneliness is itself pluralized. Not just the loneliness of many things, but lonelinesses, which is not even grammatical. Which should suggest to you something about how strange what is happening here is. So, I have 4 interpretations. This is good A05 for those of you doing the A levels. This is good showing different interpretations for why this is happening, having thought about this for a long time. One is that in the Wordsworthian experience, no matter how many people you're around, we kind of have seen this in a man speaking to men, a man, of course, who is very, very different from all these other men. A man, of course, who is much better, more sensitive, etc., but it doesn't even matter in what way he is different. When you're speaking to men, but you're deeply aware of your difference to them, the loneliness that you experience, in a way, is multiplied. Because it's an isolation even in company. You try to talk to someone and they're beneath you. That's a very alienated experience. So, if you look at the first quote, it completely accidentally fits this theory. Because these beauteous forms, nature naturally, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms, and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. This is from Tintern Abbey, one of the great epiphanic moments, one of the great moments of internal realization. And the fact that in that kind of experience you are a bit alone, no matter how in touch you are with the people you're writing for, no matter the fact that in this very poem he's not physically alone, you're transported into a relationship of loneliness, and that's an alienation that is exacerbated by multiple layers of togetherness. The togetherness with nature, which we'll talk about in number 4, and the togetherness with Dorothy, which we'll talk about with number 2. And you can kind of see how that romantic experience, which puts you in this solitude when you're with nature, at your most natural, it benefits from expanding. There's just like lonely rooms. And I kind of think about lonely rooms. Very, very often we will have a lonely room, right? Your room. Very often. But for us to think of lonely rooms, we kind of have to imagine that wherever we go, there is a loneliness to our experience. So, again, the multiplication of the solitude exacerbates this. It's like a normally isolated person, a hermit, doesn't necessarily need a pluralized solitude. But a person for whom, no matter where he goes, he is alone on some deep metaphysical level, and his experience is very hard to translate to other people, and to himself, as we see in his poetry over and over, that is a person who a lonely room is not sufficient for. There needs to be lots of lonelinesses. So, this is one explanation, one that kind of is more intuitive in my mind with just what is happening. So, going down in the same poem, 70 lines, two pluralized lonelinesses. When first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of deep rivers and the lonely streams. Why not a lonely stream, or indeed streams that aren't lonely? Partly because, and we see this with more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. That rush of excitement of being one with nature is itself a fearful, sublime, terrifying experience which separates the poet, even as he is writing to connect with people in some ways. So much for theory number 1, which is, no matter how many people there are around you, you are isolated by your romantic, no matter how much nature there is around you as well. You are isolated by your romantic tendencies, by your human sense of difference from everyone else, and many times superiority to everyone else, from your being of a completely different brand, from your experience being a completely different brand of experience. Indeed, in history, a different brand of experience. Experiencing nature like something that might be lost for the first time is an isolating experience, compared to people who could basically experience nature as something that will always be there. It is not going to be carved out, literally, of their existence by an industrial revolution that didn't happen before. So, okay, that's that paradox. Now, the paradox that I think this really works well with a more eco-critical or political reading of Wordsworth's aesthetic experience. Even a reading of the canon as kind of elevating people who elevate themselves. This is a way that elevates you when you think about it, because you're so unique. You're so separate. This is a very good way of separating yourself, is to pluralize your loneliness. There's lots of loneliness, and within the loneliness, a lot of things are lonely. Okay, so, on the opposite end is this song that I really love. First song I'm playing on video, but I'll only play like 20 seconds. And I would so love to have copyright infringement levied at my unsuspecting head. I would love to have that kind of recognition from Olu. So 10 seconds, let us see.
Open your mind, you're not alone. I'll wait till the end of time. Open your mind. Surely it's plain to see you're not alone. I'll wait till the end of time for you. Open.
I love these lines because they articulate the paradox for me. You're not alone. Cool. You're singing to me. Not alone. Feels good. I'll wait for you. Which suggests that at the moment I am quite alone. You're waiting for me to come around, but I clearly am alone when you're saying I'm not alone. And there's another paradox in the next two lines where it's plain to see, and if it were plain to see, I wouldn't need to be opening my mind. So, just a couple more of these paradoxes, and I think with Wordsworth, from a feminist perspective, the most frustrating thing about Tintern Abbey have not been to me 100 and odd lines go through that poem of extraordinary connection with nature, and they are just me, I. And then he writes, "For thou art with me. Thou art with me in these woods near this ruined abbey." And you think to yourself, and I've read this poem so many times, and it's kind of this gotcha ending or twist that it doesn't matter how many times I read it, I always get shocked by this turn of, and you are with me here. The grammar of so many instances of I and me and what I'm experiencing is so strong that turning there, it's a beautiful, for you are with me. Let us see if I have my Tintern Abbey pulled up. At any rate, to keep this a little shorter than my usual videos, number 2, I think the plural of loneliness is to suggest to us that there's something always there. That the stream is not really lonely because there are other streams around it. That it's flowing it alongside of, into, etc. The valleys are not necessarily lonely. If only because in a valley there's so much life. The cliffs could very well be lonely, but it seems Wordsworth, and mountains similarly, but Wordsworth likes his mountain ranges. So again, if these are metaphors for the poet, and if they're not metaphors for the poet, the mountain, the valley, especially in their loneliness, they're at the very least inspiring the poet. They are the source of so much of his poetry. And he is trying to tell us, even though it's my inspiration is in solitude, it's also in plurality. It's also in the other people. For you are with me. That's how the poem ends. We will go together. We will always be remembering each other and living through each other in this interaction with nature. So, this goes really well with these two quotes I have with below. I'm just gonna Command F companions. Okay. Pacing two brother pilgrims, this is him and Coleridge, or alone, each with his humor. And it's this extraordinary thing. A lonely pair of Englishmen we were. A lonely pair, and sailed along, clustered together, with a merry crowd of those emancipated, with a host of travellers. There's almost like a daffodil sentiment here, except travellers replacing the daffodils. Chiefly delegates returning from the great spousals, newly solemnized, da-da-da. Point being, as you notice, I've kind of decontextualized. I don't necessarily care about what this is about as much as I do about that interaction between, first, them and the crowd. They are with the crowd, but they are clearly separate from the crowd. And then within, they are together. They are a pair, but they're lonely. They're isolated together. And when you think about Wordsworth's poetry, so much of it is in collaboration with Coleridge, and in collaboration with Dorothy, and in collaboration with his wife, that doesn't get nearly acknowledged enough. And I think one thing he did, but that can easily be ignored, is constantly refer back and say, oh friend, the end of nearly every book of the Prelude, which there are many, many. And in between, there are all these apostrophes to Coleridge. All these statements of, with you, everything is so perfect. And yet, this is a poem of such great solitude that, and thinking about the fact that the whole lyrical ballads came about from a collaboration between a much more famous Coleridge and a then unknown Wordsworth. Came into Cambridge later, who has less of a stake in the world of poetry up to that point, and is riding Coleridge's coattails and about to exceed them very quickly, but so much in debt to Coleridge, and constantly asking for feedback and using lines from Dorothy's journals, from Coleridge. So there's the paradox of Wordsworth's romantic poetry is that it is highly collaborative and also deeply devoted to solitude, to isolation, and feels the isolation very deeply. So the grammatical lonely pair is a really great for pacing two brother pilgrims, or alone, each with his humor. So we're together alone. And you can kind of see, this is a paradox that does happen on walks, where you're walking with someone, but you're each in your own mind, but you're together. And that combination, it's important that you're together. It gives you something. There's a reason people actually prefer to walk with other people than they do just completely by themselves. You derive some energy there, but you also enjoy in these walks, especially natural walks, you enjoy the peacefulness of your own mind. So part of this is solving for that paradox, and you can see that as well with the mythical Arab. There's an Arab dream where Wordsworth, again with where are you, my mythical Arab? Gosh, that sounded awful. But yes, full often taking from the world of sleep this Arab phantom, which I thus beheld, this semi-quixotic Quixote. I to him have given substance, fancied him a living man, a gentle dweller in the desert, crazed by love and feeling, an internal thought, protracted among endless solitudes. And I think, whose solitude is this? Is this Wordsworth's solitude? The fictional Arab solitude, this phantom solitude? And that's getting us to yet another together alone paradox, which is all the people that Wordsworth writes about. And he writes so many poems about other people, but they all invariably turn into the shaping that Wordsworth gives them, have shaped him wandering upon this quest. So in a way, they're often imaged alone, but he's right there writing them. He's right there experiencing them. Their solitude creates his poetry, which then connects to other people. So it's a solitude that is very productive of community, is that paradox. And so saying endless solitudes is kind of saying, look, this is the kind of solitude that will produce so much plurality. It's like endless solitudes, protracted among, even like the idea of among solitude, with solitude. Very, very often I will see when Wordsworth has loneliness, the preposition with or to, both of which kind of suggest that connection that doesn't really fit. And I should, at this point, fairly late in the video, credit this whole storm of the mind that I've been through with these lonelinesses came from my advisor in undergrad and first and primary mentor, Eitan, saying, you know the poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud? Clouds aren't very lonely. And that has stuck with me for about a decade. And I really hope he sees this moment. And because I don't think Wordsworth picked the cloud randomly. And I don't think Wordsworth, a man who, again, was much more in touch with nature than I suspect any of us will ever be, thought to himself that clouds are innately lonely creatures, that clouds are often alone in the world. But rather, he was tapping into that paradox by saying, I wandered lonely as a natural object, that a natural phenomenon that really doesn't happen very often in isolation. And again, I wandered lonely, and immediately the daffodils come in. And immediately the older poet will come in. So there's so many layers, and the Daffodils poem is based on Dorothy's lyrics. So there are all these layers of togetherness in Wordsworth's isolation that, honestly, I understand him really obsessing over this grammatical quirk to show us just how paradoxical solitude is for a man who really, beyond loving humanity, treated almost every living being, I would say every living being that he came across, as something of a friend, in some mode or another. It's at least how his poetry conveys him. Obviously have not met the man in person. 200 years late to that party. Alright, so now I've tapped into paradox number 3, but it's worth thinking about just a little bit longer. One aspect of the paradox of poetry is that you're supposed to take, we talked about this with Lyrical Ballads video, you're supposed to take the enthusiasm of the initial impulse and experience, and then combine it with a calmer moment, kind of the enthusiastic child mingling with the more sober adult. The younger poet lending the feelings, and the older poet lending the tranquility, the wisdom to channel these feelings into gorgeous and articulate and sensible poetry. This all seems fairly reasonable, but when you think about it, what this means is that at the very least, you need 2 acts of solitude, which means you need a pluralization of solitariness. 1, you need to experience this in solitude, but then you're together with the other Wordsworth, which he very, very often perceives as another self. So even when you're alone doing your ideal poetic experiment of recollecting the emotion in tranquility, you're with the younger poet. So that in the poetic process, in that experiment, there is plural solitudes. And this is, again, just beyond the fact that you're also writing it for other people, but often writing of your mind. You're also inspired by other people, using other people's words. Beyond Dorothy, there are so many quotes. There's almost an underappreciated aspect of the Prelude is that it is a little like The Wasteland in terms of just how many citations it has. Like, it really does make a heavy use of Milton, Pope, Spencer, other poets I can't think, whose name I cannot think of right now. And naturally, Coleridge, naturally. So, those are 3 paradoxes already. And then there is, for those of you who want to do a more ecological reading of Wordsworth, and this could explain why the hills are often pluralized when they're solitary, why woods are solitary, cliffs are solitary, mountains are solitary. Not a mountain. I can't think of a solitary mountain. I have to fact check myself, but I have been looking at solitude in Wordsworth for the last couple of months, and I have not seen a solitary mountain. This has to be wrong. I have to be wrong about this. There has to be a solitary mountain. But they're often solitary together. They often enjoy each other's company in solitude. Like Wordsworth and Coleridge, walking alone together. Alone together should be Wordsworth's mini slogan. Okay, so, with nature by yourself. Now, if I asked you, oh, you went to the forest by yourself, who did you go with? Like, if I asked you, who did you go with to the forest, and you went by yourself, you would very easily say, no one, I went alone. And I might have even felt lonely. But, you, my friend, are now Wordsworth, and you probably don't anticipate and worship a relationship with nature that is much, much more intimate than walking alone through the woods. The ideal of romantic poetry is that you're writing, again, to and with a skylark, a butterfly, a mountain, a tree. That you're not just that you're learning from nature, that nature is your best friend and your mother and your teacher, all combined. And I cannot stress this enough. Literally. So, Wordsworth will often personify nature, but that is in a way a mistaken understanding of that device. Because if you think about personification, what it tries to do usually, and I could be reading Wordsworth naively, but I think that's the best way in some ways to read Wordsworth. What personification does is it says, this object, we can imagine it as a living being, or this animal, we can imagine as a human being. A dog is not having a plan to... I have no real good example of this right now, but the point being that this is a very reasonable explanation for personification in almost any other poet. But that assumes, personification assumes, that you do not actually think of the animal or the tree or the object as a person. I think that distinction doesn't exist as much for Wordsworth. I think, if anything, you could make an argument because of how everything is structured, where love of nature brings forth love of man, where nature comes first. And even when the mother nurses you into this kind of relationship and models this kind of nurturing relationship that you will have with nature, she's really doing what nature is bidding her to do, but is in her nature. So she's following a natural impulse, so that, again, if anything, instead of personification, there should be something like a naturification, where human beings, insofar as we are good because we've learned it from nature. And there will be so many statements to that effect with Wordsworth. And so, I think that's why we get solitary cliffs and solitary roads and solitary mountains, mountain solitudes, solitary shades, solitary hills, solitary cliffs, we've said. Because when you're alone with a bird around and you see a bird, it's fine. If that bird, however, is in some ways more human than personification would give it credit for, like genuinely human, if not human in the sense of, oh, Wordsworth really felt that they were talking to him and imagined himself like a Dr. Dolittle character. Maybe not that, but nevertheless, a conscious being capable of friendship, capable of camaraderie, capable of communication on some level, then to say, I am alone, or this cliff is alone, when it is surrounded by so much nature, when there are so many living beings around you, is an insult to all those living beings that, honestly, I cannot emphasize enough, Wordsworth owes 95% of his poetry to. Just in point of thematic fact, I believe that somewhere between 85 and 95% of Wordsworth's poetry is dedicated to nature. And so, to then say, and I was really, really lonely, and there's very often this experience of you go alone and you're lonely in the woods. There's something really uncomfortable there. Something really uncomfortable about erasing the obvious transcendence of nature by just kind of treating it as an object. Wordsworth, I believe, objectifies human beings more easily than he would creatures. That could be a very problematic statement. I believe this, though. Don't quote me on this. Don't in any way quote me on this. But that's how you get to this paradox around natural sceneries, where nature is solitary, but you don't let that solitude hang very comfortably, because you know that those are your friends we're talking about. Those are, like, if you went out with your friends and you said, yeah, I feel so lonely right now, your friends will likely take offense. I think there is a value to saying Wordsworth would take offense at his own treatment of nature from time to time if he didn't genuinely experience the community of nature as being with somebody else. If ultimately he's just alone. So, that's part of that paradox. Nature gives you community. So when you're by yourself in nature, you're not really by yourself. So you might as well be plural. There's just that phrasing. I'm gonna end on this. I always swear to be compassed round by mountain solitudes. You're surrounded. They're almost hugging you. That's how warm the solitude of nature is. And for us to be just compassed round by the mountain solitude doesn't really give you a sense of just how communal nature is. It's just a mountain solitary. Mountain solitudes. So yes. You're never really, on the one hand, we started with no matter how many people you are with, you're always feeling a little alienated. or more than a little alienated. But let's end with, no matter how alone you physically are, you're going to nature, you're experiencing nature. You're no more solitary than the cliff, who always has cliffs. Cliff friends, or the mountains, or the woods, or the trees. Notice how so many things in nature don't just hang out by themselves? Part of Wordsworth's comment here. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it through this video, I really hope it's less long than the previous ones. I always get so excited that I forget that people have better things to do than just listen to Wordsworth videos all day long. They really shouldn't, should they? Okay. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Assuming I can close this stop screen.